Carla Casali.
Okay, I gotta. How do I make this big?
Just
Down
one
at the bottom.
Yeah, you can go down to this little screen right here.
This thing?
There, the one over, right, one more. Yeah, that works.
One more there. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's really great to be here. Among other reasons for coming to Washington, my best friend from high school lives here. And last year, I thought I was going to be immigrating to Canada. And I did actually spend last year in Canada. And I was thinking to myself, this probably means I'll never get invited to DC anymore. But now I've since moved back to the United States, and after only 3 weeks, here I am in Washington. So I'm very excited to be here. Okay, I changed my title slightly to put in this fancy pre-title, the Eunuch's Galleons. But the topic has not changed, and you'll see why the eunuch is in there in about 15 minutes. The main idea here is to talk to you a little bit about the technology that was used in ships that were sailing the Indian Ocean, specifically warships that were sailing in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. This is a little research project that I'm working on right now that grew out of actually some criticisms that I received from my book, which now came out about 4 or 5 years ago, which was, as Susan just said, it was basically about the history of Ottoman expansion in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century and the rivalry between the Ottomans and the Portuguese. And the basic argument that I was making there was that while historians typically tend to think of the Ottomans and the Portuguese as kind of two completely different kinds of empires, the Ottomans being an Islamic empire, a land-based empire, an agricultural empire, the Portuguese being a maritime empire, commercially minded, Western, and so as a result, sort of one is representing the past and the other one is representing the future. What I was trying to say is that if you look just at the Indian Ocean and their interactions there, actually they're essentially similar. They have very similar objectives. They pursued strategies that were sort of complementary, and they were sort of successful in similar ways. In fact, depending on how you measure things, I was making the argument that the Ottomans were more successful than the Portuguese in some respects. So that was the basic argument. And I was surprised by how controversial the argument turned out to be, and I got a lot of different suggestions for ways that I could have improved it after the book came out. The one thing that I think was most consistent of the criticisms that I heard was that I had not taken seriously enough the question of naval technology. This kind of kept coming up over and over. And the idea here is that the Portuguese and the Ottoman navies were based on two completely different kinds of technologies. Okay? And here, let me show you a picture. On the one hand, this is a manuscript from an Ottoman illuminated manuscript. It's called the Tarihi Fethi Yemen, which means the history of the conquest of Yemen. It's from the late 16th century. And here you can see very clearly the dichotomy that I'm talking about. On the bottom, you've got a Portuguese-style, tall-sided sailing ship, specifically a galleon. And you can recognize that these guys are little Europeans because they have little black hats on. In Ottoman Turkish, one of the words for a European is the people who wear hats, as opposed to the Ottomans who wear turbans. Okay, so, and you can actually see, this is far away, I know, but these guys all have little white turbans on. And so, the Ottomans are using galleys, and the Portuguese are using galleons. A galleon is a specific kind of a sailing ship, which is kind of the quintessential maritime technological advance of 16th century Europe. It's the kind of sailing ship that's designed especially to be able to sail in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and it's a warship that's designed to mount lots and lots of artillery. Okay? So the reason why this is important is that, so it has, we're going to get a little technical here, okay? So a galleon is not just any sailing ship. It has 4 masts and 3 decks. All right, so keep that in mind. 4 masts and 3 decks. And the reason why this makes a difference is that the extra deck is there so that you have more space to put more cannons. This is, after all, the 16th century is the time in which artillery is becoming quite sophisticated, and the nature of naval warfare is changing. Boats are becoming platforms for artillery, and the more space you can have to put guns, the more powerful your boat will become. All right, so this is the idea behind these galleons. The Ottomans, at least in the Mediterranean, seem never to have adopted this technology. Throughout the 16th century, their navies continued to be based on this technology that was sort of left over from the medieval Mediterranean, which is the war galley. A war galley is essentially a big canoe. It's got a little sail, but for the most part, it's powered by oars. It has 25 banks and about 6 people on each of those banks pulling great big oars. And one of the disadvantages of that kind of a boat is that, imagine trying to put a cannon on a canoe and then firing it sideways. Not a good idea. It would just flip over the canoe. It wouldn't accomplish anything else. And so the only way that you can mount a cannon on a galley is by putting it along lengthwise and shooting it forward. And just from a practical perspective, there's not as much space there. This is where we get the idea of a broadside. When you fire a broadside, it literally means you're firing all of your cannons that are pointing sideways, rather than a galley, which has to just shoot the one great big gun forward. Okay? So this is the idea, is the Ottomans didn't have this access to this new technology that was quintessentially suited for overseas exploration and for projecting power across the oceans. They were still using this old-fashioned technology left over from the medieval Mediterranean, which was unsuited to navigation on the high seas. And as a result, it doesn't really matter how sophisticated their plan of attack was in the Indian Ocean, how many resources they invested in the Indian Ocean, because they were handicapped by this basic lack of access to this new innovative technology. They were doomed to fail. And had I paid attention to this, I would have realized that my argument was wrong. Okay? That's essentially, that's the idea. Now, once I heard this enough times, I started to think that I should take it seriously, that maybe I hadn't paid enough attention to the history of naval technology. And so this research that I'm going to present to you today is basically my attempt to dig a little bit deeper into the sources and find out what exactly is going on. 2 things that I should tell you before I get into the nitty-gritty. The first is that I was really kind of asking for this criticism because this picture is the picture that was on the front page of my book. So I don't really know why I didn't see this coming. The second is that just with respect to the Mediterranean, okay? Leave the rest of the world out of it. Just with respect to the Mediterranean, the idea that tall-sided sailing ships, and specifically galleons, represent a categorical advance, and that they are superior to galleys in all respects, is an idea that, starting in the 1970s, historians started to question, and now I think we can say that they have systematically overturned that idea. It's simply not the case that galleons are better than galleys, at least in the Mediterranean. Instead, what happens in the Mediterranean context is that galleys, these things, are changed. They're developed to be platforms for artillery in several sophisticated ways. And because of the advantages that galleys actually have, namely, they can move around when there's no wind, they can go against the wind if they want to, and they can also come much closer to the shore and avoid and sail between islands that are shallow because they have a much shallower draft. They don't go deep into the water. Those are all kind of advantages that overwhelm the natural advantage that the galleon has in being able to pack more artillery into a single vessel. So in the Mediterranean, what actually happens is, throughout the 16th century, everybody continues to use galleys. The Ottomans used galleys, the Venetians used galleys, and very importantly, the Spanish also only used galleys in their warfare in the Mediterranean. Even though the Spanish are the most advanced in developing galleon technology in the Atlantic, when they fight in the Mediterranean, they only use galleys. Okay? So, at least in that context, it's simply not the case that galleons are better than galleys. In the Atlantic, the situation is much different for all kinds of different reasons. It's very stormy, very high seas, and so you don't want to really be rowing a canoe in 30-foot seas. It's very far to sail across the ocean, and galleys have lots of people in them. In fact, if the idea of broadsiding somebody comes from a galleon, the idea of being heavily armed actually comes from a galley, because in the medieval Mediterranean, the more people you had on a ship, the more heavily armed it was, because you've got a bunch of arms that can bear their arms. Okay? So in the Mediterranean, that's an advantage. In the Atlantic, that's a disadvantage, because the more people you have on the ship and the smaller the ship, the less distance you can go before you need supplies. Okay? So then the question becomes, when we turn to the Indian Ocean, is it more like the Atlantic, or is it more like the Mediterranean, or is it in fact something else entirely? And when I looked into the research about this, I realized that there was in fact not very much to go on. And another kind of structural problem that we have is that Ottoman sources basically do not exist for the Indian Ocean region until much later than we would like. Basically, the 1560s are when the first systematic records in the Ottoman archives that we can access about the Indian Ocean are available. So we have to sort of piece together little nuggets of information from different places and see what we can come up with. So this is basically our question. What kinds of ships were being used in the Indian Ocean, and is the situation there more like in the Mediterranean, more like in the Atlantic, or something else entirely? All right, so let's get started. This is a magnificent map. By the way, can I borrow your watch? I might not give it back. You've been to Naples, right?
Consider it a gift.
I'll tell you guys a joke later about this. Okay. All right, this magnificent map is a Portuguese map. It was made in 1519, which is only 2 years after the Ottomans conquered Egypt. Okay, so before 1517, the Ottoman Empire has absolutely nothing to do with the Indian Ocean. It's living up in what is now Turkey and Greece. No outlet into the Indian Ocean. Nobody in the Ottoman Empire knows anything about the Indian Ocean or cares about the Indian Ocean. And in 1517, there's this lightning campaign. The Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim, best name in the 16th century, conquers the Mamluk Sultanate, which is basically the empire that rules over Egypt and Syria. And all of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire becomes a player in the Indian Ocean region. Okay, and this map was made just 2 years after that. There was a question back there?
Well, I apologize for interrupting. I was just wondering if you might be able to lower the overhead lights.
I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I'll work on it. It's basically all or nothing.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
All right. So, there are a lot of boats on this map, and that's what is going to attract our attention. I'm going to zoom in. So, I think I've got to zoom in, which is over here. Oh, okay, first I'm zooming in over here. Right, so very conveniently, the artist has made sure that we know whether the ships in question are Christian or Muslim ships. The Muslim ships have crescents on them, and the Christian ships have little Portuguese cross flags on them. Okay? Now, there's a couple of interesting things to notice right here. First is that there are plenty of Muslim ships that have that are sailing ships. But are these galleons? No, these are just dhows. These are traditional Indian Ocean sailing vessels. They have at best one deck in the back and just two masts. Okay, so this is not nothing special. What we would expect. That, though, is a little bit surprising. This is a galley, and it has a Portuguese flag. So, actually, the Portuguese ship is not a galleon. It's an oared ship. It's a Mediterranean-style galley. That's a surprise. Now let's look over, that was over here. Now let's look over here. Okay, now this is getting weird. We have two Muslim ships again. This one looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. This one definitely 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 masts. 7 masts, and it looks like 4 decks. So this is a really unexpected kind of a ship. It's something apparently much bigger and more substantial and even more designed for artillery than we would expect.
How much can we believe the accuracy of this?
Great question. So how much can we believe the accuracy? Almost not at all. Okay, this is a guy who never went to the Indian Ocean. Okay, he's living in Portugal and he's drawing things. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he wasn't actually there. On the other hand, he's making this for people that are going to the Indian Ocean. So it sort of makes us kind of wonder, why is he putting these things on there if they would have been completely incongruous and unbelievable for people? But it doesn't prove anything. It's just kind of, it's one of those brain teasers. Maybe it's a sign, at least, that while historians have kind of assumed that the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic are the same, that maybe it is not, in fact, the case. All right? Now, in order to satisfy our curiosity in a more systematic way, I had to telegraph forward in time until the year 1538. So this is now 20 years into the future, 19 years into the future. The reason why 1538 is important is because in that year, the largest Ottoman fleet to ever sail in the Indian Ocean left Suez and headed for Gujarat, which is in northwestern India. This was a big deal. Okay, there were about 80 vessels in this fleet. There were about 10,000 people in the fleet. And to put that in perspective, the entire population of the Portuguese Empire in India, in all of the Indian Ocean in the year 1538, was about 8,000 people. So there were more people on this fleet than there were in the entire Portuguese Empire, Portuguese population of the Portuguese Empire. Okay? This is a very big deal. And it's an even bigger deal when you think about logistically how it was accomplished. Because one of the big challenges, this is a terrible map to be showing you this, but one of the big challenges that the Ottomans have is that there are no forests in the Middle East. That's kind of one of the things about the Middle East. There aren't any forests. So if you want to build a fleet in Egypt, you have to be able to get the wood from somewhere. And so for these 80 ships, every single board of every single one of those 80 ships was cut in the forests of the Black Sea, loaded onto transports, brought through the Dardanelles and into the Aegean and across the Mediterranean, and unloaded in Alexandria, then taken on barges down to Cairo, then loaded onto camels and donkeys and carried across 100 miles of desert, and then assembled in Suez, and then sailed to India, okay? Which is not only logistically challenging, it's very, very expensive, okay? So this was a big deal. And because it was such a big deal, we actually have a lot of information about the kinds of ships that were being built there, because it took a long time and people were very alarmed about it. And so there were all kinds of reports. People were sending spies to Suez and paying people to tell them what was going on. And so we know quite a bit about these ships, even though we don't have any documents from the Ottoman archives that allow us to corroborate this information. We have Venetian sources, we have Portuguese sources, we have other European sources. So we know quite a bit. Let me tell you, I'm going to share with you the data from the most detailed contemporary Portuguese account of this fleet, okay, which is something called the Lendas da Índia by a guy named Gaspar Correia. He's a very important 16th century Portuguese chronicler and somebody who actually wrote his chronicle from India. Exactly contemporary. Okay, so this is the breakdown of the fleet. There are about 85 ships altogether, and these are the oar-powered vessels. I won't get into the details, but this is actually surprising also. Compared to a Mediterranean fleet, most Mediterranean fleets would have lots and lots of this kind, which is the kind of a standard Mediterranean galley, and only a couple of these kinds, which are great big, sort of oversized galleys with extra space. Instead, this fleet has lots and lots of great big oversized galleys and only a few of the little galleys. So even in terms of the oared ships, this is a surprise. But now let's look here. These are the sailing vessels. We have 6 supply ships, 5 galleasses, and 5 galleons. Now there's a couple of things to notice here. There are galleons in this fleet. And I'm not the first person to notice that people are saying that there are galleons in this fleet. But other historians that have noticed that the sources say that there are galleons in this fleet have basically explained it by saying, well, these aren't really galleons. These are just big sailing ships that are being used to carry supplies. They're not warships that are being used as platforms for artillery. They're just supply ships. Okay? Which is the way that they were typically used in the Mediterranean. The problem is that there's a different category of ship here that's called supply ships. So if these are supply ships, why are they being singled out as being galleons? Okay? Now, fortunately, in addition to this list of the ships, the same source then goes on to describe each one of them in detail. Okay, so let me give you the little paragraph where he describes this kind of ship, which is rather mysterious. This is supposed to be a hybrid ship, something called a galleass, which is in the Mediterranean, not supposed to have existed until after the Battle of Lepanto. And then we'll look at the galleons itself. So first, his description of the galleass. Okay, so he says, this is a ship of 3 masts and decks that carried half basilisks. A half basilisk is a gigantic cannon that is carried on the largest size of galley. It's a bow gun. So it had half basilisks at the prow, and on each side it had 4 large pieces of artillery and 6 smaller stone-throwing guns. So this is, because it has a great big bow gun, and it also has guns pointing to the sides, we can sort of piece together that this is, in fact, similar to a Mediterranean galleass. It's something that has oars and multiple decks and sails. And it's designed to be able to maneuver like a galley, but also to have artillery mounted on its sides like a galleon. We actually have a painting from the 17th century, from the first Ottoman naval history that was written in the 17th century that has illustrations. And this is an illustration, again, not based on any direct observations, but just sort of imagining what one of these ships might have looked like. And so you have, again, oars like a galley, and multiple decks like a galleon. Okay? Again, it's surprising to see this kind of a ship here. It's not supposed to be there until a century later. All right, now let's look at the galleons. Here it says, these are ships with 4 masts and 3 decks. That's exactly what we want. 4 masts and 3 decks, each with 4 large artillery pieces on each side and with 20 smaller guns mounted above that fired stone balls. These were dangerous ships to navigate because they had a shallow draft and no keel. Okay, so now there's no more doubt. This is not a transport ship. This is a galleon. It's a ship that is intentionally designed as a platform for artillery. It has the extra deck for the artillery and it has the extra mast for maneuverability. Now, it's also not a very good galleon because it doesn't sail very well. So that's a different problem. But there's no doubt that it actually is a galleon. Okay, so we can now say pretty categorically that the Ottomans did in fact have galleons in their fleet.
Why would they have left the keel off?
So what that means is that it probably means that instead of having, it's like this, right? So instead of having a keel and then a rudder that's built into the keel, it has a steering mechanism that is separate from the hull. Yep. All right, now I have one more piece of evidence here, and I'm adding this because it's visual evidence and people love pictures, number one. And number two, because it shows you the serendipity of history and the interconnectedness not only of the world that we're studying in the 16th century, but also the world since then. So here we have something which is called the Roteiro of João de Castro. João de Castro was a man who would eventually become the governor of Portuguese India. Before that, he participated on an expedition that was a retaliation for the Ottoman attack of 1538. So the Ottomans sailed to India. They failed to conquer the Indian fortress that was controlled by the Portuguese. That was their main target. On the way back, they conquered Yemen, and then the fleet returned to Suez. And then 2 years later, the Portuguese organized an expedition from India, which they sent to the Red Sea and was supposed to burn the Ottoman arsenal in Suez. So this is a retaliation. And this guy, João de Castro, is a participant on this mission. And he actually makes a kind of a ship's log, which is designed so that when somebody else wants to make the same journey, they'll be able to follow the same itinerary. And in each step of the itinerary, he actually makes a drawing. So this is the drawing from the day in which the Portuguese attack the Ottoman arsenal in Suez. And this book, the autographed copy of this book, is at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the James Ford Bell Library.
Now we know why you took the job.
Unbelievable. Who'd have thunk it?
This is first of all, it's a great drawing. Here are the Ottoman garrison of Sipahis that are menacingly galloping around in a circle, brandishing their spears. And here are a couple of more that are running up by the shore. This is the arsenal. Excuse me. This is the arsenal. And let me now zoom in to this little area so that you can see it more clearly. Actually, let me not do that quite yet. You can see that these guys are shooting at each other. So there are Ottoman cannons that are shooting from this strong point here on land. So these are Portuguese ships. And notice again, these are galleys. They're not sailing ships. So now we have two bits of information. When the Ottomans sailed from Suez to India, they did have galleons in their fleet. When the Portuguese sailed in the other direction, they used galleys, not galleons, to attack the Ottoman arsenal. And now let me zoom in. Okay, now here we're stretching the limits of the human being's ability to draw because the whole image that you're looking at here, which is now blown up to the size of this wall, is the size of a quarter in the actual book. And these ships here would be maybe the size of my pinky nail. Nevertheless, we can still see, despite the fact that they're so small, that, keep in mind, this is a guy who will eventually be the admiral of the Portuguese Navy, so he knows about ships. He's making a special effort to show us that these have 1, 2, 3 decks, okay? So those are, almost without question, the same galleons that Gaspar de Correa had discussed in his source.
But without the masts?
The masts are taken down because they're in dry dock.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, here you can see the Ottoman galleys are beached, and here they are sitting at the University of Minnesota for all to see 500 years later. All right. So I think we can settle that question. We have there's other corroborating evidence too. We have an account by a Venetian who actually was a participant on the Ottoman side, who sailed to India and back, and he talks about these galleons too. There's just no question. We have visual evidence, we have documentary evidence. There were galleons in the Ottoman fleet. So then the question is, what happened after? if they had them at this moment, why do we not know about it? And why does it seem that it didn't actually translate into some sort of systematic use of these ships later on? So that's our next task. Oh, I forgot about one more entertaining. This is especially for you. We know not only that these things were here, but we also have a very clear idea of how they got here. All right, and that is that there were two very colorful individuals. Both of them were Venetian nobles. One was a guy by the name of Giovanni Francesco Giustiniani, and the other one, Francesco Cacciadiavolo Contarini. Cacciadiavolo means the devil chaser. The Cacciadiavolo Contarini was actually a very highly placed official in the Ottoman Navy right before this expedition. Giovanni Francesco Giustiniani is in some sense even more interesting because he had actually gone to Portugal in the early 16th century and had himself sailed with a Portuguese fleet to India in 1505 and had spent about 10 years in the service of the Portuguese Estado de India, then came back, went to France, offered to build 5 galleons for the King of France, and he said he was going to sail with them to India, take over the Portuguese colonies there, and declare the King of France Emperor of India. The King of France turned him down. Then he went to Istanbul and he made the same proposal to the Ottoman Sultan, who also wisely turned him down. Now I say wisely for an important reason, which is that maybe you guys haven't heard much about this debate, but if you go to Turkey, first of all, you'll always see maps of the world map of Piri Reis. Are you guys familiar with the world map of Piri Reis? It's this map of the New World that was made by this Ottoman cartographer in 1513. And then people will say, Piri Reis, he was such a smart guy. If only the Ottomans had been clever enough to understand the importance of the New World, then they would have been able to conquer the New World instead of the Spanish, and the world would be speaking Turkish now. Why didn't they do that? Okay? There's a very simple reason. It's impossible. Okay? It's impossible. Because there's a very strong current that that flows from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean on the surface of the Straits of Gibraltar. Down below, the current flows in the other direction. But on the surface, there's a fast current that flows from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean. The prevailing winds are also always from the west to the east. So it's very, very hard to sail from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. You can do it, but you can only do it in certain times of the year. And when you do it, you have to be able to wait around, sometimes for weeks, until the conditions are just right, and then you can slip through. That's the reason why when the Spanish sent fleets to the New World, they sailed from Sevilla, because Sevilla is on a river that opens into the Atlantic. They never sailed from Barcelona or from Saragossa, from any of those towns that had actually much bigger ports that were in the Mediterranean, because it's very hard to sail through the Straits of Gibraltar. That's the Spanish. That's why all of the Italian explorers that went to the New World, like Columbus and like Giovanni Caboto, they always sailed in the service of Atlantic fleets, never directly from Italy. And if you were going to try to sail from Istanbul, so first you have 2 months across the Mediterranean, then you have to wait alongside the coast of Spain, which is the most dangerous enemy that you have, that definitely knows that you're coming, hope for conditions to turn out just right, and then you have to be in the Atlantic by the right time, because if you don't catch the winds, you have to wait another year. Okay? It's impossible. There's no way you can do it. These are not modern container ships. You can't just go anywhere you want. You have to be able to start from the right place. Okay? So there was no way that was ever going to work. Giovanni Francesco Giustiniani was trying to make a good deal for himself, but his plan was not a realistic one. But it seems that both of these guys actually were hired by Hadim Suleiman Pasha, the eunuch who was the governor of Egypt and the person who eventually became the admiral of this fleet that sailed to India, brought them to Suez and placed them in charge of building the fleet there. Okay? And And that's the result. Okay. I'm falling a little bit behind. We have actually, there are more sources that I could share with you that testify to the existence of various kinds of Ottoman tall-sided sailing ships in the Indian Ocean in the years after 1538, but that's actually not the big finding from my research that I want to share with you. Instead, it's something different. Because of the nature of the sources, especially on the Ottoman side, which are very kind of sporadic and for the most part not narrative, I built a database. I hired a couple of graduate students, one who knew Turkish and one who knew Portuguese, and I employed them for the summer, and I had them look through a bunch of sources, and they made 2 databases. And out of these 2 databases, I have 1 table and 1 graph. Okay, I'm very proud of them, especially the graph. Are you guys ready? Okay. The first is a table in which we have, from the Ottoman archives, all of the fleets that were not necessarily built. This is an important point. Not necessarily built, but that were ordered to be built from Istanbul, and money was requisitioned for them to be built. And those documents that show us that the money was being requisitioned also tell us what kinds of ships were supposed to be built in very rough terms. In other words, whether they were sailing ships or whether they were galleys. Okay? So, here we go. 1531 is the earliest, 1585 is the latest, and here you have the percentage of ships that are sailing ships and the percentage of ships that are oared ships. What I want you to see here is that over time, the percentage of sailing ships goes constantly down, and the percentage of oared ships is going constantly up. So as the Ottomans are becoming more familiar with the situation in the Indian Ocean, rather than building ships that are more and more like the Portuguese ships, they're actually building ships that are less and less like what we were expecting them to build. They're becoming more and more reliant on oar-powered ships rather than sailing ships. Now, there are a couple different interpretations of this. One could be they try to build ships that are like the Portuguese, and they fail. And so they just fall back on what they know, which is not very good. Okay? This would actually support the argument that my critics of my book were presenting in favor of the Ottomans' failure to be able to compete. The other argument might be that they're actually using this oar-powered ships because they work better for some reason. So in order to find out which one of these things is more likely, I actually then turned to the Portuguese side. And I had my other graduate student make a database looking through these 2 important Portuguese chronicles that always tell you every kind of ship in each fleet, and making a table of the fleets that are sent from India specifically against Ottoman targets. Okay, so these are not just all the Portuguese fleets, but only the ones that the Portuguese are sending to confront the Ottoman fleets. And I put these into a graph rather than a table because graphs are more exciting than tables. All right, so here we go. Look at that. The blue is the percentage in each fleet that is a sailing ship, and the red is the percentage of each fleet that is an oar-powered ship. And this is over time from the beginning of the 16th century until 1560. What you see is that over time, as the Portuguese are learning how to fight the Ottomans, they are doing exactly the same thing that the Ottomans are doing. They're using more and more oar-powered ships and fewer sailing ships, until by the time you get to the 1560s, they are essentially only using oar-powered ships. No more sailing ships at all in the fleets that they're sending against the Ottomans. This is a big finding in my small world. And it really makes us reconsider, at a very basic level, what we thought we knew about the importance of sailing ship technology for the success of the European age of exploration. What's happening here seems to be that both the Portuguese and the Ottomans early on are experimenting with tall-sided sailing ships, and then it seems to be that the Ottomans are becoming more and more successful at using a kind of oar-powered, smaller, lighter, maneuverable galley, which they're using as a kind of corsair lightning attacks against Portuguese sailing ships. The Portuguese are learning that their sailing ships are actually vulnerable because they are not as maneuverable as the galleys are, precisely in the same way that sailing ships in the Mediterranean are vulnerable. And so they also are readapting their technology in order to meet this challenge from the Ottomans. So rather than a triumph of sailing ships, it's a triumph of oar-powered ships. Yes?
So did you find any evidence of that in the chronicles that you looked at, in terms of the strategy that the Portuguese used?
Yes. So this is great. This is like a cartoon. Okay. This is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So here are all the Portuguese ships sailing along, and these are the Ottoman ships. This is an important encounter in the Persian Gulf in the 1560s. Okay, and this is the Portuguese second in command ship. The Gonçalo Pereira is the guy's name. But this caption says, "This is the fleet with which Dom Diogo de Noronha went to look for the Turkish galleys, and he found them." All right, so this is the Portuguese sailing ship, and these are the Ottoman galleys. And essentially what happened here is it's too shallow, and the wind died, and the galleys first escaped by going close to the coast, which was too shallow for the sailing ships to follow, and then when the wind died, they came back, and then they just surrounded this sailing ship, and they bombarded it until it was overwhelmed.
So those are holes in the sails?
Those are whole, and this is blood in the water.
Did you discover a link between like the Greek galleys and the Ottoman galleys in terms of their geographic?
You mean the ancient Greek
Yeah,
galleys,
right,
the triremes? You're talking about triremes?
Right. Did they continue that, and is that where the origin of their technology might be?
Well, I mean, in the Mediterranean, people had basically been using various kinds of galleys
Right.
for thousands of years. So, yeah, so in the extreme sort of triumphant Western narrative, like there's my arch enemy is a guy named Svat Sucek, and he says, oh yeah, well the Ottomans, they were using the same technology that was already known to the ancient Greeks 2,000 years before.
And the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, right?
Right. So there's obviously nothing particularly innovative about using a canoe, right, or a rowboat. It's not fancy technology. But what's different about these is, first of all, there's the question of mounting a cannon on them and using them in a particular way that's suitable for warfare that isn't hand-to-hand combat. It's cannon technology. But then what happens is it's not the same as the kind of galleys that are being built in the Mediterranean. At first, what happened, as we saw here, is they thought, well, maybe we should build galleys that are bigger than the kind that we build in the Mediterranean. But eventually what seems to have happened is they stopped doing that, and they started making smaller ones that were actually more maneuverable and that could just hold a smaller gun. And that was because they figured out how to use the monsoons to their advantage. Okay, so because the monsoons are always sort of blowing in one direction one part of the year and another direction the other part of the year, there was one Ottoman corsair. He did something innovative. He would always leave from Mocha, which is right there, in the beginning of the winter. And at that time, the wind is always blowing like this. So he would be able to come up the coast really fast by going with the wind. And then he would poke around up here, which is the most sensitive part of the Portuguese shipping lanes, because it connects Hormuz over here with Cambay and with Goa. So there are always merchant marines that are going back and forth. And he would wait, and when he found one, he would attack it. And then there would be a Portuguese armed patrol of sailing ships that would try to chase him, and he would just row back down the coast. And because the wind was always blowing that direction, they couldn't follow him. He did it again and again every year for about 10 years. Okay? And he started getting more ambitious. Then he started sailing down to the Maldives and then coming back to the Swahili coast in the spring. And the Portuguese were panicked about it. Okay, so you can see this once you know what's happening from the data. You can then go back to the narrative sources and you can understand what's happening.
What
Yeah.
about the issue of cargo space? Because a galley carrier has less space, right? So
Right,
that's
so-
a problem in trade.
So these are not used for trade.
Okay,
These are not used for trade. These are only warships.
okay.
And in fact, another thing that starts to happen is that so the Ottomans have a very close diplomatic relationship with the Sultan of Aceh, which is in northern Sumatra in Indonesia. And one of the things that they do is the Ottomans actually start sending galleys all the way across the Indian Ocean to Aceh. And then there are spice ships that are big, tall sailing ships that they then accompany back across the Indian Ocean as a kind of an armed escort, precisely because they can't carry enough spices in their holds.
Right.
Okay. There's one last little piece of evidence that I want to share with you, and then I'll stop and I'll just open things up to question. So this is methodologically important, but it's also sort of important in terms of my conclusions. Methodologically, in my field of Ottoman history, you can say anything you want, but if you don't have a document from the Ottoman archives, it doesn't mean anything. You could have 170 different sources in 57 languages, and they wouldn't care unless you have a document from the Ottoman archives. And it can't be any kind of document from the Ottoman archives. It has to be an unpublished document from the Ottoman archives. Because as soon as a document is published, it completely loses its persuasive power. It's not there anymore. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is I want to share with you an unpublished document from the Ottoman archives. And it does something that I think is quite important, which is that it shows that as this process is going on, okay, so you have these two polities that are arriving in the Indian Ocean by two different ways. One is coming around Africa, the other is coming through Egypt. One is sort of introducing what they know from the world of the Mediterranean. The other is introducing what they know from the world of the Atlantic. They're competing with one another, and as I think I've shown to some extent convincingly, they are developing in a way that actually leads to something new. But what I also want to show is that it isn't only about one another, and it's not only about the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, it's also about what is going on in the Indian Ocean too, and what both the Portuguese and the Ottomans are learning about local conditions, but also about local techniques, local technologies, and local building and craftsmanship expertise that they're taking advantage of. Okay? So one of the things that is very important is that the galleys that the Ottomans eventually start to build are hybrids that are to some extent based on the kinds of ships that are already being built in the Indian Ocean before they arrive. Okay? And so this is the document that I want to share with you at the end. So this is from a collection which is known as the Register of Important Affairs, or the Muhime Defteri, which is from the year 1568. Okay, so it starts off like this. An edict to Sinan Pasha. Sinan Pasha is the governor of Yemen, who has actually just been sent on this big expedition because there was a Shiite rebellion in the northern part of the Yemen. An edict to Sinan Pasha. Behram, the current Beyler Bey of Yemen, may his success continue, has sent a letter to my imperial threshold in which he reported that because 3 galleots, a galleot is a small kind of a downsized war galley that becomes the Ottoman's vessel of choice in the Indian Ocean, are required for the defense of the ports of the province of Yemen, he has sent Bali Rais, one of the Galata sea captains, along with a register to Istanbul. His report says, okay, so what's happening here is, there's a guy who is an official of the Ottoman arsenal in Istanbul. His name is Bali Rais, Captain Bali. He was sent to Yemen as a part of this big expedition to put down the Shiite rebellion. And afterwards, he writes a report about local shipbuilding technology, which he then sends back to Istanbul. And then The Sultan is sending a letter back to Yemen based on this report that was sent by this guy Bali. Now gives you also an idea of how tricky it is to work with Ottoman sources. They're not like European archival sources for the early modern period. You almost never have the letter that somebody actually sent from somewhere. Never. Not never. Almost never. Only in very unusual circumstances. Most of the time, you only have the bureaucratic residue of what somebody actually said or what somebody actually wanted. Somebody goes somewhere, writes a letter, and then somebody else asks for something, and then the government tells somebody to do something based on that request. And that's the only thing that you know. Okay? So we have to fill in the blanks with our imagination to a certain extent. But it's quite interesting. It's still an interesting sort of a shadow of this fascinating story of this person from the Ottoman arsenal in Istanbul who gets sent down to Yemen, goes on a fact-finding mission about local shipbuilding, and then sends a report back to Istanbul, and then we have some sort of record of that. Okay? So his report says, this is a summary of the report. The sea around the above-mentioned province of Yemen is filled with coral reefs, and because of this, it is difficult to use large galleys. Since the materials for the construction of the kalites, this new kind of ship, cost less than for galleys, and since they can be used more easily than galleys in the waters off Yemen, and since these expenses are minimal, sending these materials instead of completed ships is seen to be both useful and profitable. Construction materials for these kalites should thus be delivered from the imperial arsenal directly to the above-mentioned province, for if they are instead assigned to be built in Egypt, their construction will be delayed and it will be a long time before they arrive here. So basically what he's saying is stop building ships in Egypt according to the plans that you have in Istanbul. We don't have any wood, so just send us the wood and we'll take care of the actual building of the ships here because the people here know how to do it. We can do it better and more cheaply than you can do it yourselves. So just let them take charge. Okay? So again, it might not seem like much, but it's a very interesting kind of a window into a much more complicated process of gradual adaptation, learning not only about the Portuguese, but also about the local conditions of the Indian Ocean and the local expertise that's available that the Ottomans can then take advantage of. And in the end, you have something that is not the same as the Mediterranean, not the same as the Atlantic, and not the same as what was in the Indian Ocean before. It's something entirely new. Okay? All right, now, to conclude where I started, this is the picture that I began with, which I foolishly put on the cover of my book, which showed this extreme the unbridgeable technological divide between the Portuguese down here with their tall-sided sailing ships and the Ottomans up here with their outdated Mediterranean war galleys. What I did not tell you is that although this painting comes from a book called the Tarikh Fethi Yemen, or the History of the Conquest of Yemen, this particular battle was not in Yemen, it was in Tunisia in 1574, and that is not a Portuguese ship, it's a Spanish ship, and it shouldn't have been there to begin with because it was in the Mediterranean and galleons are no good in the Mediterranean. So the Ottomans actually won that battle. What I could have put on the cover of my book, which I did not because it was not nearly as good of a picture, is this, which is from the same manuscript, and it actually does show an encounter between an Ottoman and Portuguese fleet off the coast of Yemen in the year 1569, except in this case, as you'll notice, the Ottoman and the Portuguese are both using oar-powered ships, but this new kind of downsized, highly maneuverable Indian Ocean war galleot, which is something new that they had basically both produced out of an interactive process based on confrontation with one another, but also through interaction with what they found in the Indian Ocean and the people and the technologies that were already present. So, to end, you already learned a little bit about connected histories, which is kind of the dominant paradigm now for the new way that we have of understanding the early modern world, which is a model which accentuates interconnectivity and cross-cultural influence. Basically, the idea of connected histories is that rather than seeing the early modern period as the moment in which the differences between the civilizations of the world crystallize, that it's rather a period which is defined by interconnectivity and which you can use to sort of destabilize the idea that world history can be constituted out of gigantic blocks called civilizations that sort of progress through time independently of one another. That's kind of the idea of connected histories. The thing is, connected histories has until now shied away from the history of technology. And I think one of the reasons is that people have the impression that technology is somehow too rigid, and that if you talk about technology, it will actually weaken your case, because technology seems to be one of those areas where the differences between Europe and the rest of the world are actually great, much greater than in other areas. And so people get skittish about talking about technology, and I certainly felt the same way myself. But what I've learned from this project is that it's not the case. We can talk about technology, and we can discover actually the same sort of paradigm emerging from the technology that we can see from learning about culture, from learning about religion, from learning about diplomacy, which is that the early modern world is not a world in which the differences between East and West are crystallizing, but where rather the interconnectivity is producing something entirely new. So, I'll stop. Should I turn the light?